A little bit farther than Pete, but I won't demand your respect. I'll just try to keep you awake. So I hope everybody had a good lunch. Expect as people digest in the back couple rows to see a few heads nodding, but I'll try to keep you awake. We all love to talk about models, I know, and how they work, and I'm going to try to keep this at a fairly high level, not get into the details, a lot of these tools we have, but try to give an appreciation for how they work, how they differ, what they're good for, what they're not good for, what options are out there, and really the benefit that we try to get out of the models. So, we have a lot of emotions when we start talking about models. In my experience, they're not real positive. Um, Mostly a lot of frustration or fear or, just not wanting to talk about it. So why is that? Why don't we like models? One is this idea of the black box. We have things that are going on in there that we just don't know about. We think it's real complicated and in a lot of ways maybe pretty sinister. Um, we have these sayings that surround models all the time. Things like garbage in, garbage out. This saying from George Box: all models are wrong, but some are useful. I think we start to hear words like garbage and wrong, and we just we stop there. And so we tend not to think about the benefits of the models very much and just their problems and what we don't like about them. So what I want to try to do today is a few things. I want to try to lay out in the beginning a little bit why I think we can get some benefit out of the models, and then talk a little bit about what kind of models are out there, how do they differ, and then how do these differences determine or help us determine what they're good for, how they should be used, how they shouldn't be used. So when we think about non-point source phosphorus pollution, all the talks we heard this morning, what do we really want to know? First, for a given land use, how much phosphorus is going to be lost? How much of that phosphorus is going to be transferred through our stream networks, our drainage networks, the hydrology that we heard about? And when it gets delivered to the water, what's the impact it's going to be? So, at a high level, this is what we're trying to find out. And this is really what we're asking of our models. We're asking our models to help us out with this information, especially at these bigger scales, or when we start to talk about all these complexities that we hear this morning, all these trade-offs and feedback. So in this talk, I'm going to focus on, when I talk about the models, that first picture there, how much phosphorus is lost from the landscape. So the models I'm going to talk about are based around that sort of part of it. But the principles that I'll discuss can be applied to the models that we use to look at transport through stream networks, and then the models we use, that are in the water that are trying to do the sort of nutrient circulation and the impact of those. So when we want to know how much phosphorus is lost from the landscape, what do? Well, we measure. This is a typical picture of how we measure how much phosphorus is coming out of a land use. So the question is always, well, if we can measure, then why do we need models? Well, when we start to think about, okay, what kind of information do we want to measure? What kind of information that land uses do we want information on? We start to lay our scenarios. Well, we might want to investigate several different types of soils. And within those soils, maybe high, medium, low, very high phosphorus content in those soils. So, every time you add a variable here, you start to have to multiply them together. So here, you got already 20 different scenarios. And then you start to talk about, well, what land use? Let's say whether I'm growing, I got pastures, or whether I'm growing crops. Am I tilling, no-till, reduced till, more conventional tillage? What kind of management do I have out there? How much phosphorus am I applying? What source? Is it a fertilizer? Is it a manure? If it is a manure, what kind of animal? All these things that create differences. So you start to add even sort of basic levels of these variables. We start to add all these up, and a big one is years of weather. If we're going to monitor out in the field, well, we want to have different types of weather that come along to see what the impact of the weather is. So, we're pretty quickly up to just these laying out 175,000 different combinations that we think that these are pretty basic. We want information on these. So we can't possibly use monitoring and physical monitoring alone to get all the information that really is demanded. You hear all these questions all the time. That's the kind of information we want. So models can help us estimate what we can't monitor, what we can't measure. Models can help us be cost and time effective. You know, this cartoon is maybe a little bit of an exaggeration. We think models are expensive to use, but you know, what's our alternative? Well, we just implement it and see what happens, right? We wait. But the pace that we're asked to provide information is a lot faster than something like this, 15 years. We need to know things a lot faster than this. We need to identify options pretty quickly and then work to implement those. So models can help us be cost and time effective. And then when we think about all the complexities that we've heard about this morning, all the physical complexities in the landscape, you know, we can sort of have our fixed variables. We can't do much about the weather. We can't do much about the landscape or the soil type that we're given. You know, we have our phosphorus sources. How much phosphorus is in the soil? What kind of manure or fertilizer we're putting out there and at what rates? Our management that we're doing in the field, whether we're tilling or we're putting buffer strips in or things like that. All these are going to affect then our transport mechanisms that Tony talked about, drainage and runoff and erosion. So these are all going to affect, you know, our phosphorus loss, whether it's soluble P or sediment phosphorus loss. So then we start to look at all these interactions. You know, our fixed variables in weather and soil landscape, they're going to affect how much runoff we get, how much drainage there is, things that Tony talked about. You know, our weather is going to affect the phosphorus that leaches out of our fertilizer and manure that's if we surface apply them. You know, our soil type is going to determine our soil phosphorus availability. Our fertilizer and manure is going to determine how much phosphorus is in the soil. You know, and those are going to determine phosphorus that's lost in drainage or runoff. Our soil P is going to affect every transport pathway of phosphorus. You know, our management then is going to affect everything in general. So, I mean, our interactions get to be really complex really quickly. So when we think about these, you know, in our discussions today, we're talking about these complexities and we're thinking about them and we get great questions because everybody's thinking about this. But, you know, we're really limited in our brains to thinking about only a couple interactions at a time. And these feedback loops, so we think, well, we can handle a couple maybe in our head, but once we start that web that you see in the picture behind there, you know, it gets to be too complex, too fast for us to process that mathematically. The models allow us to sort of formally map these complexities out, see if we can map them out in a way with our understanding conceptually and mathematically, see if we can map them out well enough to actually make a reliable prediction. And if we can, then we can start to find practices, you know, to have the greatest impact, whether it's negative or positive. So a big thing models helps us do when we start to step through this formal process is we identify our knowledge gaps. You know, we don't seem to be able to predict this very well, or I don't seem to understand what the impact of cover crops is on dissolved phosphorus loss. Is that a knowledge gap in my model? That's something I need to go research, generate some information on, get that in there. So it can really help us identify what we don't know and key on in on that on our research. But ultimately, you know, if you can go through this, a real nice positive model development process, you're going to help improve your decision making, take it beyond the limits of your experience and assumptions and our sort of our brain capacity to, you know, process these multiple feedbacks and these interactions, especially these sort of nonlinear actions. You know, we're okay at thinking of things that, where, you know, this goes up by 2, and okay, this one goes up by 2, and things start happening in curves. It gets a lot more complicated for us. So that's really, I covered so far some of the benefits of models, some of the reasons why we even go about trying to build models and use models, and what kind of information we're trying to get out of them. So now I wanted to talk about when we look at phosphorus models that are out there that have been developed, what kind of models are out there, how do they work just in general, and then what are they good for, what are they not good for. So in general, we sort of have 3 different types of models. We have these pretty complex models that we use from the sort of farm to watershed scale, things like the Integrated Farm System model, the SWAT model, APEX, and AGNIPS, and, you know, everyone's favorite, I'm sure, the Chesapeake Bay model. These are complex models. There's a lot of moving parts in them, and they're designed to be used at the field to watershed scale. Then sort of we have our user-friendly sort of quantitative models that kind of use the same types of equations, same type of processes, but they're designed to be used just, look at one field at a time. And so they're designed to be a lot more user-friendly. And I'll talk about some of the details of these models. And then towards the other end of the spectrum, even a little more simple is, our simple risk assessments, our traditional sort of first generation phosphorus indexes that probably a lot of people are familiar with. So I wanted to look first at these two on the right, sort of compare those. How are they similar? How are they different? And then talk about the complex models a little bit, and then talk about appropriate and inappropriate use of these different options we have. So I'll focus on the Apple model. So that's going to be our sort of quantitative, simple model, and then the p-index for our risk assessment. So they're similar because they're annual time sets. They're going to look at, what's your risk of phosphorus loss this year, based on what you've done. They're field scale. We're going to look at one field at a time. They're not very data intensive. You don't need a lot of experience or skill necessarily to use these relative to some other models. There's no calibration needed. We don't need to start to play with the parameters to get the model to give you a better output. And what's important is they're using the same variables, and they're using variables that we heard all about today. Soil pH, manure and fertilizer, runoff and erosion. All these variables that are going to control phosphorus loss, they're going to use those variables in their equations. So how are they different? Ultimately, math. They're using the same variables, the same type of information, but it's how they start to multiply and add those things together, those variables, that's going to basically give you different types of output. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how these different approaches result in different outputs. So we look at a p-index. Probably, pretty familiar with this. We sort of lay out our transport parameters, and we'll go through each one and give those a score. We'll look at our phosphorus sources, our soil pH, fertilizer, application and rate and application method. Same with manure. So we're going to go through and give those a score. And then we're going to, in this case, we sum up our left side, multiply it by connectivity, divide that product by 12, and then multiply the sum of the right side. So that's the math behind something like this. So when you get to the Apple model, and models like this that are more called quantitative or process-based, how are they working? The math is different. So basically what these models try to do is to model how we measure. So when we think about how do we measure sediment-bound phosphorus loss in runoff, for example. Well, in the field we're going to measure, we have our flume set up, water goes through the flume. We're going to measure how much water is flowing through there. We're going to take samples of that water. We're going to measure how much sediment's in that water. In that respect, we get a measure of how much erosion there was, and then we're going to measure the phosphorus content that was in that sediment. We're going to multiply those two together, and that's going to be our sediment phosphorus content. So that's how we measure it in the field. So that's how these models try to estimate it. They'll estimate erosion using a tool like Russell 2. Either we measure soil total P, or we can estimate that with some functions we have. We multiply the two together, and we get sediment P in our model. So we're modeling how we measure. That's what we're trying to reproduce this process that we understand, this process that we know in the field. We're trying to model it the same way. So we're just doing the same thing with our runoff dissolved P. We're estimating and we're measuring runoff. We're measuring the P concentration in the field. Same thing with the model. We're estimating runoff with something like the curve number. We're estimating what the P concentration in that runoff is going to be based on soil test P, the manure fertilizer we put down. And the same thing with drainage, dissolved P in subsurface drainage. We're going to estimate how much water is going to move to our drains with a tool like something like DrainMod that's going to look at the physics of the water processes there and make an estimate of how much water is going to make it to that ditch. And then we're going to estimate the concentration that's in that groundwater. So we're measuring, or we're modeling how we measure in a process-based model, which is something that the Apple model tries to do. So Then we compare. So we have two models, two different types of models of P-index Apple that are set up the same way, using the same variables, the math is different. So how do we go about then saying, well, which approach should we use? Which one is better? Which one? Well, one thing we can do is we can compare it to measured data. This is not the only way we can test a model, and sometimes our models are not set up necessarily to test against measured data, but this is one of the things that we do. So because the Apple model is set up to model how we measure, when we compare it to measured data, it compares pretty well. We can do good predictions of phosphorus that might be lost from the field and runoff and erosion. Because the math of the P-index necessarily is not set up how we measure necessarily. The relationship sometimes is not as clear. It gets to be a little more of a challenge to use measured data to evaluate this tool and what this tool is trying to do. Something like this, I think, also demonstrates sort of our evolution of the model. Sometimes the P-index on the right there is sort of a first avenue, first generation. We're trying to make an easy tool that you can use rapidly, it's user-friendly, people can understand it. We put it together, we get it out there. When we start to test it, we see how it works. Well, we find out, okay, this is maybe not so great, that's not so great. Let's evolve this thing. Maybe we get towards more the left-hand side of the screen where it's still user-friendly, where we can test it with a lot of our measured data. So some of the things that you see when you go through this testing, this is why the model testing is so important, understanding how it works. What is it showing it's doing a good job at, necessarily not doing a good job at? Things like with the P-index, you might have points where you have higher erosion and low P application, where you're measuring a lot of phosphorus loss here, but it's kind of giving you a low risk, is what it's telling you. Or you might have a situation where you have low runoff and erosion, but you have a high P application rate. Where they didn't, in this situation, in this study, they didn't measure a lot of phosphorus loss, but the P-index was saying you have a high risk. So maybe this sort of tool is it's designed more to look at your P application, your manure fertilizer applications, how you're doing it. It's designed to look more at that risk than something like Apple that's looking maybe a little more at the whole system. Just on the left side where these two dots fall out with the Apple model. One of the things we can do when we start to look at the process-based things, we would call this sort of dynamic model. Something that is not just, it's going to predict changes out with time, out in the future. We can see, if I keep doing this, what's going to happen to my soil P over time? On the left, yeah, on the left. No, you're right. On the right, we can look at changes in soil P with time, and we can look at these different depths. We talked about stratification this morning. We can look at changes in soil P in a real shallow layer or in that whole topsoil. And we can see, how is my phosphorus loss going to be changing through time as my soil P might change. So we can start to ask these questions as a matter. So I talked about the models on the right here, some of these more simple models, whether it's a risk assessment or it's a more process-based model. But then we get into our more complex models, our field, farm to watershed scale models. So, some things I think about, and it's a legitimate question, seems maybe kind of simplistic, is if we're managing at the field scale, then why didn't we need the real big complex watershed scale models that are maybe not going to be good at telling me what I need to do with my field? Well, there's kind of information that we want to know beyond the field scale. What areas or regions broadly might be contributing the most phosphorus? Which types of broad land uses, ag, urban, forest? How are they each contributing relative to each other? These are things that we need to get into watershed scale models and assessments to try to get this type of information. Some of these other questions, especially when you're trying to link what we're doing in the field to water quality downstream or in the bay, we have to do those assessments. This is ultimately what we want to know. How is what I do in my field going to affect water quality, we have to assess that with our models at that scale. So that forces us, we don't really have much of a choice to get into a watershed type scale analysis. So some of these other questions that, we really need to get beyond the field scale and forcing us to put together watershed scale models. And some of our regulations are going to demand this, an analysis at this level. So there's really, when you start to get into the watershed scale models, you get to have a lot of different types of models that are out there. There's things that we want to be able to do sort of simultaneously in these models. We need to simulate sort of the vast spatial and temporal variability that exists out in the landscape. We want to be consistent with our observed process, how we understand, how we measure, how we understand phosphorus removed. That's how we want to model it too. But at the same time, given all this huge landscape and these complexities that we see, we want to try to keep our model as simple as possible and not have to, get enormous amounts of data that we might not have to be able to make this model run. And then ultimately, we want to, be able to use our results to make better decisions than just what we understand to make. So you can imagine that different people have different ideas about how to go about this process. So ultimately, you got different strokes for different folks, so you end up with different types of models. I think a model ought to be constructed this way, another person another way, so a lot of times you end up with two different models. And there's two different models out in the world that people are using. Sometimes they share some things, they're doing the same thing, sometimes they're way different. So what are some of these differences in this scale models? One is going to be how do they simulate the physical and biochemical processes that we heard a lot about this morning, the sources and the transport factors. Are they going to fully try to represent that reality, try to get the math to, model how we measure? Or are they going to use something like the USGS Sparrow model, more of a statistical relationship between sort of land use inputs and what we monitor and sort of develop a statistical model that's not trying to represent in a process base that reality, but look at the relationships of these things statistically and build a model that way? Or is it going to be somewhere in between? So all these examples exist. One of the big things, how are we going to represent spatial variability in the model? There's lots of different things that go on in the landscape, as we know. How are we going? We're going to try to model every little field that's out there and then add them all up. I mean, that's probably unlikely at big scale. So we start to lump things together. Well, all the cornfields that are on this type, we're going to treat them as basically one big field, regardless of where they are in this county or so. And we're going to simulate that as one big field because you just can't get any finer than that and keep the model at a complexity that our computers or we can, even us, can manage. So we're going to lump things into one big bucket, or we're going to distribute it at a real fine scale. Is it going to be somewhere in between? Those are some of the things that create differences in the watershed scale models. And then how do they represent time? Do we want to simulate a single storm event, trying to capture what happens in big hurricanes? Do we want to be able to simulate 20 or 30 years? Do we want to simulate just 1 year at a time, 1 month at a time, or do we want every storm and every day that comes along? So these are some of the questions that you have to decide. The finer you get, the more complex you're going to get, the more data you're going to need. So these are real critical things that you think about and design when you build these models. So given that those, what I've described, the characteristics of these different types of models that exist at the watershed scale, how does the Chesapeake Bay model work? Where does it fall on that spectrum? This is just a quick overview. So there's probably people here who know a whole lot more about this than I do. So it's a process-based approach. It's going to use physical equations that are going to try to represent the physical processes that are going on out there. Equations are probably pretty simple. When you look at them, you're like, oh, a lot of times in these models, the math is not really complicated. It's just simple addition, multiplication. It's just lots of moving parts that make them complex. We would call it semi-distributed, so it's not lumping everything into one bucket, but it is lumping basically at the county scale. It's going to treat sort of the county, simulate that county. and then these different so county land segments and then these river segments. It's going to divide the watershed. So we would call that semi-distributed. Um, One of the big things that you have to do in these models is you're calibrating it. It's got a lot of variables. So you're adjusting those variables that you don't really know what values you should have for those. And they're going to control some of the output the model gives you. So we're going to adjust those values a little bit, make sure the model is giving us output that's matching what we're seeing in our rivers and it's seeing in our streams. So that's the whole calibration process. And it's going to simulate many years at daily to sub-daily intervals. So that's how it deals with time in the model. And that's all I'm going to say about that. So what are the models good for? Given these different types that we have, the different way they work, what should we use them for, what should we not use them for? You know, models aren't Swiss Army knives, right? You can't do everything. And, you know, contrary to some advertisement, you can't believe that they can do everything. So you got to know what they're good for and what they're not good for. So let's start with the P-index. You know, sort of simple risk assessment type of tool. Not very complicated math. So it's real great. It's great for education, right? Got the important factors of phosphorus loss. I can put it up there. We can talk about each of these variables and why it's important. It's in a format that makes sense to people. Their erosion goes up, P loss goes up, my risk goes up. And it's conception, that way it's conceptually correct. It's directionally correct, as I said. You know, if I increase erosion, my P loss is going up. It's not going to give me the wrong direction. What's it not good for? Well, quantitative uses. Unless it's proven otherwise, that it's not designed to tell you a pound per acre of phosphorus loss at the edge of your field. So the way that the PI score changes up and down is not the same as up or down of phosphorus loss, and sometimes it's not even consistently proportioned to that. So if I double my P score, it doesn't mean my phosphorus loss is doubling. You've got to be careful with that. So in that respect, it can be a challenge to meaningfully compare our phosphorus index output to our measured P loss, because the math is just not the same. So we got to be careful with that. Is that the best way we want to evaluate it? And it's not appropriate for event-based. It's sort of an annual evaluation. Not going to handle different spatial things. What's happening up in the corner of my field where it's real wet and down here where it's dry? You know, it's not going to look at that, and it's not going to look at anything beyond the edge of the field. You're not going to be able to use this to say how am I affecting downstream water quality. So Apple is going to be similar. You know, all these same things that the P-index is good for, Apple is good for this as well. Again, this is more of a quantitative process-based math that's going on. So it is, in that sense, it is appropriate for quantitative uses. It's designed to give you an estimate of actual P loss, pounds per acre of P loss. As we showed, you know, you can look at dynamic changes in soil P over time and soil P loss. We can say if I change my application rate, you know, what's it going to do to my soil P for the next 30 or 40 years? It also gives you information on the specific sources and pathways of P loss. How much of the dissolved P that was lost in runoff came from manure or fertilizer or soil? So it can give you that information so you can target not only how much dissolved P there was, but, you know, we can look at, you know, it's not in there now, but cover crops, for example. If we get some equations in there, we can say, okay, relative to how much you're using from your manure, maybe cover crops, while you are losing some dissolved P, maybe it's not that big a deal. Again, what it's not appropriate for, event-based, it's not going to look at a single storm that comes along. I just put my manure out there, I got the rain the next day. How much did I lose? Well, this model is going to look at the whole year. It's not going to look at that one storm. We have some tools that can look at single storms. Again, the spatial variability is not there and beyond the edge of the field. So the watershed scale models, what are they good for? Again, these big landscape scale type questions that we need to know. How will changes at the field affect water quality downstream? You know, how much of my landscape needs new practices? Things that we need to, at these bigger scales, we need answers to. Because they operate at these big scales, um, they're not necessarily very good for telling you down at your field scale what you ought to be able to do. I mean, how can a model that lumps everything at a county scale, like the Chesapeake Bay, hope to give? It's not really designed to give you information about what you ought to be doing on your field. It's just not. It doesn't operate at that scale, and so I always get a little nervous when we start to say what use that types of models to say what people ought to be doing at their field scale. Because how you have to represent things spatially, it's not going to say, this field up here is where the runoff comes, and then the runoff route through there. It's not always going to do that spatial representation. So it can be tough to use these to say, where do I need to put my buffer? Where do I need to put my grass waterway to be most effective? It's not going to be good for that. Now, some models, even though they are beyond field scale, may be appropriate for that. So you got to know how the model works and whether or not it's appropriate. So what are some of the strengths and challenges we have for the models? Some of the strengths, I think we're really good, and our equations are really good in understanding and simulating the effect of phosphorus sources and transport on feed off. So we know if the runoff goes up by this much, that's how much your phosphorus is going to be lost. The same with manure. If I double blind manure application, we can give you really good estimates of what that's probably going to mean for how much more phosphorus you're going to lose. Some of the other things that we're not so good at, that we're challenging, is predicting the actual quantities in spatial simulation of runoff and erosion. It's still tough for us to say, this is how much runoff you're going to get from that part of the field. That's still a challenge. As Tony presented today, just understanding that research is still ongoing. We're not as strong as drainage and related phosphorus transport in the subsurface. It's just something historically that hasn't been researched as much, and that information just hasn't gotten into models. Transport through stream networks, again, is something that historically hasn't been studied as much. It takes a while for the research to get its way into the models, so that's still happening. How can we reduce the complexity of models, these things that operate at these big scales, but still make them reliable, still make them robust? Can we even do that? That's a challenge for sure. And then uncertainty. Having some way statistically in our models to tell us how good the prediction is. Can I trust this prediction? You tell me it's pretty good, but give me a number that says is it plus or minus 10%. We're still struggling with that, and that's a challenge. We have ways to do that. We got to get those into our model. So this is, my last slide. So there's a lot of information. Models give us a lot of anxiety, I think. I like to use them. I like to build them. I think it can be a great process to really improve your understanding of things. But there's an appropriate time to use them. And I think models can really improve our ability to make decisions. But we need to understand them and agree with the science and the data behind them. If we can't understand them, then we got to trust that the person explaining to them understands them, and we trust that communication. So there's a responsibility of the model developers and users to communicate what the model's doing, but there's a responsibility of the audience then to do the job to understand it if they're going to be impacted by what the model's telling them. So we want to understand and agree how the model works, how it's generating output. It's got to be transparent, that whole process. We just agree with how the model works, the science, the data that it's using, and we feel pretty comfortable. We know it's not a perfect tool, but it's pretty good. We like it. I'll finish with this thought: is that models shouldn't exist in a vacuum. They need to be. Of course, we need monitoring data to build our models, to even understand how to go about constructing them. And so, when we start to get monitoring and modeling working together, that's really the best of both worlds. And in that sense, we can really have a whole that's greater than the sum of the parts. If we get those two working together, we can really improve our decision making. So I'll thank you, and I guess we'll take questions.